Hello Synapse community, my name is Ryan Majidimehr and I'm a product manager from the Azure Synapse Analytics team. Today we're going to talk about Power BI Datamart and Azure Synapse Analytics. You'll recall from the last episode in this series that we talked about how Azure Synapse and Power BI Datamart complement each other if you're going to build out for broad swaths of scenarios in analytics. In this episode and in future episodes, we're going to talk about some specific scenarios and architectures, if you will, that you might use these two products together. Those are Lakehouse, Data Warehouse, as well as data enrichment for AI. Now, as with last time, I'm joined by Pawel Potasinski. Well, Pawel, welcome, and tell us how you might build a Lakehouse with Power BI Datamart and Azure Synapse.
Thank you, Ryan. Let's start with what data lakehouse is. We can consider lakehouse as a combination of a data lake and a database. Data, often counted in terabytes or even petabytes, is stored in files of various formats in a data lake. But at the same time, this data stored in files can be accessed like it was in a database, for example, using SQL language. Azure Synapse Analytics can be used to build a lakehouse from the scratch. You can use it to ingest the data from practically any source, load it into a data lake and transform it to make it useful for analytics. Then you can create a lakehouse over a data lake to make data easily accessible using well-known SQL language. Finally, you can build a set of Power BI data marts and load into them subsets of data from your lakehouse for self-service analytics or external data sharing.
Can you show us how to start building a lakehouse in Synapse? Maybe with some data ready to go so we can start querying.
Sure, let me show you how to use sample datasets and notebooks that you can find in the Knowledge Center in Synapse Studio to have some data ready for use right away. Next, I'll create a simple lakehouse on top of this data. To start playing with sample datasets provided by Microsoft, connect to your Synapse Analytics workspace using Synapse Studio. In the home page, click on the Knowledge Center, then choose Browse Gallery. Go to the Datasets tab, pick the dataset that you're interested in, for example, New York City Yellow Taxi Trip Records. Click Continue. Notice that you can preview your dataset and read more information on that. Then click Add Dataset. After a few seconds, you should see your dataset ready to use with SQL queries and notebooks. Sample datasets are great. However, for the purpose of this demo, I will use sample data loaded into my data lake. Here I have two sample datasets, IDS weather data and New York City Yellow Taxi Trips data, both coming from the sample datasets provided by Microsoft. Please note that for the purpose of this demo, the folder structure of my data lake is simplified and does not contain things like data lake zones. The data of my datasets is partitioned by year and month and stored in Parquet format. Partitioning is done to minimize the amount of data processed by the queries looking for the data forms from specific periods. Just like with sample datasets, I can quickly generate SQL scripts to query the data in my data lake. To do this, I right-click on the file and choose New SQL Script, select top 100 rows. Notice that the SQL script is not the only option here, and you can immediately create other artifacts like notebooks or data flows to interact with your data. After the query is generated, I can modify it and then run to explore my data. Later on, I will use a similar SQL code to create views in my lakehouse. To load this data into my data lake, I used a notebook and Synapse Spark. The code of this notebook comes from the PySpark version of the Using Azure Open Datasets in Synapse sample notebook available in the Knowledge Center of Synapse Studio. The major modification to the original code is saving partitioned data in Parquet format to the data lake. Once I had the data in my data lake, I was able to create a lakehouse. My lakehouse contains two views allowing to query both sample datasets. The definitions of these views are simple select statements, similar to the auto-generated ones. They contain two additional columns, year and month, generated using the filePath function. The filePath function returns specific parts of the paths marked with star wildcards in the paths. In my case, specific year and month. Also, I'm using star wildcards to allow querying of all Parquet files in each folder. Notice that these columns generated using the filePath function are aligned to how my data is partitioned in the data lake. This is intentional to optimize the queries searching for the data from specific periods.
That's pretty cool, and not that complicated. So, how does it work with Power BI Datamarts?
Let me show you how by connecting Power BI Datamart to the Lakehouse I just created in Azure Synapse. To connect to my Lakehouse using Power BI, I need the serverless SQL endpoint. I can copy it from the overview page of my Synapse workspace in the Azure portal. Now I can switch to Power BI. To be able to create Power BI Datamart, I need access to the Power BI Premium workspace. Here I'm using Premium per user workspace. To create a new Datamart, I simply click New Datamart. To connect to the Lakehouse built with Azure Synapse, I click Get Data. Then I search for Azure Synapse connector. I select it. In the server name, I paste the serverless SQL endpoint previously copied from the Azure portal. In the database setting, I put the name of the Lakehouse. I set organizational account as the authentication method. I click Sign In. I select my Azure Active Directory account, allowing me to connect to the Lakehouse. And then I click Next. I selected both of my views in the Lakehouse and click Transform Data. Now I can use a well-known Power Query user interface to transform data coming from the Lakehouse. For example, let me filter both queries by year and month. To do that, I click on the year column and choose text filters equals, and then I pick a year that I'm interested in, for example 2010. I select OK, and in a while I will see the data only for year 2010. I do the same for month because I'm interested in only December data, so I put 12, click OK. And now I see only data for December 2010. Thanks to that, I can limit the amount of data loaded to Power BI Datamart for self-service analytics. You can play with Power Query to shape the data as required. Here I applied several transformations to the trips query. For example, I changed data types. I chose only relevant columns, and I renamed all the columns. I also did several changes to the weather query. Once I'm done with all the transformations, I click Save. And the process of loading the data from my Lakehouse to Power BI Datamart begins. Once the data is loaded into Power BI Datamart, I can query it using SQL. Keep in mind that this select statement queries the fully managed Azure SQL database created behind the scenes for this Datamart. I can also modify the Power BI dataset created automatically with the Datamart, for example by creating a relationship between two tables. Finally, let me rename my Datamart to give it more meaningful name, for example, New York City Taxi. And then when I have my Datamart ready, I can use Power BI Desktop to connect to it and create visually appealing interactive reports for my business users. As you can see, it's quite easy to connect to Azure Synapse and provide a subset of data from the Lakehouse for self-service analytics. Back to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Pawel. So to wrap it up, Power BI Datamart works great with a Lakehouse created with Azure Synapse. So tell us in the comments, have you used Datamarts yet with Azure Synapse? What are your favorite scenarios? We'd love to hear about it. Again, my name is Ryan Majidimehr. You can find me on Twitter. You can find Azure Synapse on Twitter, Azure_Synapse. You can find Pawel on Twitter, Pawel Potasinski. He does already have more followers than me, so, follow him, also follow me. It's a fierce competition, and I'm falling behind. At any rate, speaking of social media, or social media influencers, I should say, the Azure Synapse Influencers. It is a very exciting program. You should all sign up. There's fancy titles. I am a champion. Some people aspire to be champions. They are champions in marble, waiting to come out. Be freed from the marble. Like, comment, subscribe. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.